Welcome back to the Femme FC Podcast. Today we have Wyatt Hampstead. Wyatt is in his second year as a PhD candidate at the University of Wollongong. His research focuses on re-examining the role of neuromuscular fatigue as a risk factor for ACL injuries in women's football players. He's currently an associate lecturer at the University of Wollongong within the Faculty of Science, Medical, and Health. He assists in teaching clinical exercise physiology. He has 5 years of experience in private practice, specializing in musculoskeletal injury rehab and prevention, ACL reconstruction, chronic pain management, and the development of personalized exercise programs for chronic health conditions. Wyatt, thank you so much for coming on. I'm so excited to hear about your PhD and everything else that you're doing.
Thank you for having me. It's always a privilege to even be able to speak about it.
Great. So would you mind just starting off a little bit about what your PhD is about, why you decided to study that and undertake this long, arduous journey of a PhD within this topic, and kind of where you hope to go with it?
Yeah. So like you said before, my PhD is re-examining the role of neuromuscular fatigue as a potential risk factor for ACL injuries in females football. And my experience is mostly working in rehab in Australia as an exercise physiologist. So we're quite similar to physiotherapists and physical therapists as like in America. So seeing firsthand experience of like the effects of suffering an ACL injury, both physically and mentally, I just want to try and create a bit of impact and see if we can decrease the risk or examine like exactly what's going on. And having the opportunity to speak to like fellow researchers from UOW as well as RMIT with Evangelos, Rick and Matt Whalen, they gave this opportunity about looking into fatigue and ACL injuries. And I thought, wow, I've got to take this opportunity, and things don't arise that often. So knowing that I can help potentially move the needle a little bit and to understand these problems, better see meaningful progress and how we can better protect our athletes. And moving forward, like hopefully just like keep on looking at this problem, providing meaningful and modifiable ways of reducing risk. And that's what I'm hoping for in the future, is hopefully my research can at least provide some evidence of like reducing some type of risk.
And so you just published the first study from your PhD, is that correct? This was the first one?
Yes, it's the first one.
And you looked at timing of ACL injuries in women's soccer specifically. Can you talk a little bit about that study and then also kind of how it ties into the larger scheme of your PhD and where you're going next with it?
Yeah, so before I go into it, first I've got to like give some context around why we want to be looking at neuromuscular fatigue. Because historically it's been unexplored for injury prevention in like women's football, specifically in ACLs. And when we look at the research in the field, it's very inconclusive in terms of like, is it a risk factor? Because we see it potentially can increase injury risk towards it actually maybe even protective. And this is because a lot of the methodologies and definitions in the research is very not aligned. Like they all don't agree on the same terms. So what we aim to do is to clarify all these and determine if neuromuscular fatigue is a risk factor, how may it increase its risk for ACL injury. So looking at the timing provides clarity to like the periods and figure out, is there any trends, which we did find, but then it creates a foundation for like future research into my PhD, looking at the mechanical and neuromuscular factors, as well as potentially looking at like workload chronically, as well as travel. So it's just more or less like a great introduction into it, provides context to why my future research may help.
Yeah, so I definitely want to dig into this study specifically and then get into a discussion about the implications for what that might mean and how it relates to the larger picture of what you're studying. So going into this paper specifically, can you explain for the listeners, what were the main findings? Maybe if somebody hasn't read the paper, obviously the headline gives it away a little bit, but can you just explain the main findings?
Yeah, so what we did was we looked at when these injuries occur. So we got all this information just from online resources that just looked at like using substitution data from like Soccer Donna. And we just pinpointed exactly the moment when they left the game as a result of the injury. But we also looked at video footage to clarify that. And what we identified was that a lot of these injuries are occurring very early on in the game. So 50% before 28 minutes and 70% before 45 minutes, which shifts the thought process that cumulative fatigue is probably not a strong risk factor for these injuries. But we can't dismiss acute or transient fatigue, which does manifest earlier phases of the game because the match intensity is quite high during these periods. So what we're thinking is that match intensity is potentially a contributing factor towards these injuries because since you're running faster, you're playing harder, and since you're trying to decelerate, accelerate more often, that's going to be more mechanical load onto the knee joint, potentially creating vulnerability.
And so, yeah, there was this long held belief that it was this chronic fatigue, or as they get more fatigued. And this kind of influenced training and rehab in terms of let's test them in fatigue states and let's train them in fatigue states to make sure that they're ready for that. And this kind of flips that and says, well, is that actually the problem? Because if we want to address the problem, we have to know if this is actually a contributing factor to it or not. So I love that this shows, and there has been other
Yeah.
studies. I think you cited in yours two other studies, Lucarno and I'm going to butcher this last name, but Achenbach, um, showing that
Yeah.
they do tend to happen earlier in the match than what would have been assumed for so long. But yours showed even earlier than those studies.
Yeah.
And what do you think is some of the reasoning behind that?
Yeah. So yeah, like it was good to know like a lot of the findings we found sort of agrees with the previous literature, even with the men. So like these injuries are typically occurring earlier. Um, so what's most likely driving it is this effect from acute fatigue. So what I need to clarify is like the definitions that we've used. So think cumulative is workload throughout a match, right? Acute or transient is this short term, like short sprints, accelerations that happen periodically throughout the game. And then I guess we'll use another term called chronic fatigue, which is this build up of like fatigue through training, match, and so forth. Our first thought is one that acute fatigue may be impairing the neuromuscular system temporarily by decreasing the neuromuscular control as well as rate of force development. We know that players, even after acute fatigue, can still produce quite high amount of forces. However, we know that they may have reductions in like rate of force development. And since ACL injuries occur very quickly, like within 50 milliseconds of initial ground contact, a reduction in your ability to recruit muscles may create a temporary window of vulnerability for the knee. So that's what our thought process is like. Oh, if acute fatigue can change the neuromuscular system that way, it may provide some insight towards how it might influence ACL injuries. But again, we can't dismiss that players may be going into these matches um, being vulnerable because chronic fatigue, as we know, like build up of multiple matches, how there's more competitive matches in the calendar, they may be just not prepared to enter the match in general and increasing their risk no matter what. So we can't dismiss that as a risk factor.
Yeah, that's a great point, is that there's a difference between the cumulative workload of over the course of a game or a match versus the chronic workload of, if you have 3 weeks in a row of having a midweek game or you're at a tournament, like that's going to be different and act differently on the system as opposed to just your standard one game a week. So that's a great kind of differentiation to make there. And a curiosity that I have with this is within your data, because you looked at multiple leagues around the world, you looked at international versus national level games. Was there any difference in leagues or regions? I'm thinking in terms of what the typical match schedule is like for a given league, and also what are the resources in a given league, and maybe those things contribute to injury rates and how early they occur in a match, etc.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That was something that we looked at as well. Like just out of curiosity, it's like, oh, what if we looked at different leagues? But as you probably know, as you separate to different samples, your like confidence in it declines, unfortunately. But the typical trend that we saw was no matter what, if it was a national game, if it was in England versus in Spain or in like Portugal, these injuries, no matter what, are just occurring earlier within the game. So it seems like a universal theme across all the leagues or competitions.
So then it kind of lends into how do we, knowing this, right, across competitions levels, across leagues, it's happening earlier in matches than maybe once thought. So if now then the logical conclusion from that isn't, okay, we have to train them under fatigue, test them under fatigue, what now then is the takeaway for practitioners in terms of how to train athletes to be best prepared for these high intensity minutes earlier in the game?
Yeah, and that's probably the most valued point is like, great, you figured out this information, but how can this translate to the people who want to like better prepare these athletes or reduce some type of risk? And from the talks that we've had with like other like physios and other scientists that are very interested in this field, as well as like Matt who works with like the Matildas, it's more or less making sure we're just better preparing these players for these intensity periods, right? Like looking for the like lowest hanging fruit is, are we making sure they're sufficiently primed for these periods of high intensity, right? So like, is the warm up that we're doing on a day in, day out enough of a stimulus for the neuromuscular system to be primed? That would just be the lowest hanging fruit, like the first thing we can try to add value. And I hope that most teams, no matter where, is doing something that's replicating in the intensity of the match. So other than like the dynamic warm-ups, stretches, and drills, like maybe including intense bursts of speed with decelerations that are as close to the intensity of the periods at the earlier phases of the match. I think that's probably the lowest hanging fruit in terms of like what that's like a must. But then moving forward is maybe we have to be more proactive with our injury prevention programs and being more specific to like the moment or the actions that these injuries are occurring. So specifically, we know the situational patterns, we know it's pressing, we know it's tackling, we know it's being tackled. So, and we know these type of injuries occur when players are running quite high speeds as well. So including aspects of the game where these situations are occurring could provide more value to the injury prevention programs. But saying that, like exposing players to different varieties, so it's not just one form of like situational pattern, it's a variety. It's players getting exposed to different angles, different velocities, different cognitive aspects. So that's probably the most important part, and definitely future research needs to go into it to verify these or to hold if it is true. But that's what I would say as practitioner is, yeah, one, just making sure that your warm-ups are intense or priming the players for these periods. And two, if we are doing injury prevention programs, how do we better optimize it? How can we make it specific towards how these injury mechanisms are occurring? So training these players and helping them be ready for these periods is the main message.
And that makes me think about the idea of training players for worst case scenarios of a game, and the idea of we can look at what an individual athlete's typical match demands are across a 90-minute game and make sure that they're ready for that. But then we can also look at, okay, what are the most intense moments or the worst case scenarios? And so think of game moments being high transition moments, or you're on the attacking team taking a corner kick or a free kick down in the attacking third, and the other team gets a quick transition moment and you're chasing, doing almost a 70, 80 meter sprint back to get back and defend, and then having to transition again onto offense. And so how related is this and
Yeah.
the high intensity moments of the beginning of the match? How related is that to potentially an individual player's like worst case scenario moments on the field?
Yeah, like it most likely has a like somewhat of a correlation, right? And just making sure like that's what I think is just exposing these players to all these different scenarios and like very contextual what they're most likely going to have to do and them getting really confident like that motor learning aspect of it and then different ways of doing it. So at the end of the day, if we can try to build potentially resilience to acute fatigue, where players are able to do the like high intensity bursts, but under like correct technique and decision making, I think that's another aspect that would be great for future research to look into. I know like a lot of the research in isokinetic is looking at the neurocognitive perturbations and like the player's decision making. So yeah, definitely all of it has relevance towards the mechanism, but also potentially decreasing risk, as well as like return to play.
Exactly. I definitely want to touch on return to play in a second as well. But you touched on like the neurocognitive aspect of it. And it really makes me think of in terms of how a game plays out as a player, the first, 10, 15, maybe even 20 minutes or so is a lot of open play. Of course you go in with a game plan, you know what, tactically you're trying to do as an individual and as a team, hopefully. But it's a lot of reading and
Yeah.
figuring out what is the opponent doing, what is my response meant to be within our game system here. And so I could understand draw maybe a
Yeah.
correlation there with, okay, maybe that open play is more of a higher cognitive demand. Like, I don't know what's going to happen. I have to react a little bit more, higher cognitive loading in those moments. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's something that we really want to look into is like that tactical aspect because the way if you look at like the amount of distance or the high speed running of like of the players throughout the game, what you see is this huge variation at the start. Like their sprinting is very intense. It's just chaotic. There's no real consistency. But then you get to around like the 25th minute and you just see that it levels out. And it's usually the same until the end of the game. Then it gets to halftime, and then you see that huge spike in load and sprinting. Then it gets back, and then comes back to normalcy. So I think it's like that chaotic, intense players trying to figure out how the opposition's playing. They're trying to do a lot more prediction, and then they get that sense, and they get the flow. Then they can figure out the game. And knowing that players want to start hard, like that cognitive arousal is quite high. Like they really want to start hard, really try to score first because we know there's a strong correlation between getting a goal quite early on and winning. So it's a very positive effect to start fast. So definitely there is that aspect to it where there's all that arousal, intensity's high. Players are trying to figure out the gameplay, like the open field, the parallel running, the moment, which all creates more mechanical loading when these players are trying to decelerate, change direction. So there's so much more that we can look at and figure out, which is really good, which means there's more research to be done. But yeah, the tactics I think would be an interesting field to further explore.
Yeah, it really highlights the idea that you really cannot separate out the physical, tactical, technical, psychological components of the game. Like those are the four pillars of the game, right? And you really can't just separate one
Yeah,
without considering the others. And I think maybe where we've fallen short or maybe been little bit blind in as healthcare professionals, as performance professionals is trying to just tease out that physical component. And so what I like about this research that you're doing and, talking about isokinetic, people like Dusty Grooms doing the neurocognitive stuff is indirectly putting the tactical side back into it and the psychological side back into the game because you can't separate it and just say, well, physically, this is what's happening. You have to understand the whole system of what's going on.
yeah, and it's so unpredictable, right? Like it's like we try to predict injury or try to figure out like players at risk. Like it's chaos. There's no prediction involved, players will move randomly, perform everything spontaneously, and that's just the nature of the game, unfortunately.
Yeah, and so it actually leads me to have another question that I don't think was necessarily like teased out and looked at in this study, but maybe it's something you noticed in your data set or are looking at in the future is going back to that idea of acute versus cumulative versus chronic fatigue is okay, so timing of ACL injuries in a match earlier in the game than previously seen or previously believed. What about timing in a season? Is that something that you've looked at, are looking into?
Yeah, like unfortunately, we didn't specifically look at like that aspect, like yeah, the timing of the season. But when we look, I guess we can look at the previous literature that Lucano's done, as well as like Buckthorpe and the isokinetic team, and they do see some trends like at the earlier phases, but it's something that I'm not like when we looked at, we weren't like too sure if this is something that's significant enough, but what would be interesting would be look at the instead of like the season is the variability in the players' workloads in terms of like international gameplay, switching leagues, switching clubs. I think that would provide really good insight rather than just like the part of the season because a lot of the players might be just playing that season, right? But then you've got these international or players transferring from different clubs and their cumulative workload in terms of like from chronically of the season is a lot more than the player just plays that like block or that window of their own league season.
Yeah, and there's the previous research, like the UEFA Champions League studies, that did show something in terms of for the men's Champions League teams. This was only in the men's side, not the women's. Was early in the season an uptick in injuries, and then after like the Christmas break there was an uptick in injuries, and so there were kind of key moments of the season that was maybe making us think, okay, well, maybe they're just not prepared enough going into the season. They need a longer preseason period, or they've come off of, a congested fixture around the holidays, have a bit of a break, and then come back in. And so there's that, but then there's also some good research looking at like serial MRIs of the ACL during the course of I haven't seen it in soccer, but there's competitive downhill skiing. There's a study in that where they did serial MRIs, and the ACL actually changes over the course of that competitive season. So that again kind of speaks to it. Like the ACL can adapt, and there's studies about the ACL actually showing some hypertrophy after loading it appropriately. And so there must be something about, like not necessarily timing of season, because like you're saying, there's athletes who go play in the Olympics and then come back. When I worked in the NWSL players would play in the US and then in our off season go play in Australia. And so they were playing in two professional leagues in a year. And so there are players who kind of add to their chronic load in that way. And then I wonder how that affects ACL injury risk.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. There's like research like is ACL like a chronic workload? Like does the ACL just get to the point where it's just too much and it just gives up? Basically, just like too much load and it's just not unable to repair. But there's also that notion like since we can get stronger and we've seen that the ACL can grow in size, like is there specific training protocols or like exercises that we can do to actually increase the strength of ACL? Like that would be incredible to figure out, and then we can actually better prepare players who may be at risk of injuring their ACL, like just knowing like previous risk factors and things we know that correlates quite strongly with increase in indirect and non-contact ACLs. Yeah, no, that would be quite fascinating.
Yeah, and so you mentioned earlier how knowing this, the timing of the ACL injuries and it not necessarily being a cumulative fatigue effect, but this acute and transient fatigue. And that has implications for training, which you talked about, but also rehab and return to play testing. So what is kind of your take on how practitioners can use this information to better optimize their rehab programs and how they assess a player's readiness to return to sport?
Yes. So, like, looking to the future, like, yeah, after they complete their rehab, like, what are other aspects that we can actually draw upon this research into practical guidelines? I think it's more or less like the return to play assessment, especially in like that professional league, may look at like football specific protocols where we're looking at how the neuromuscular system reacts in the acute settings, like how they're able to control themselves when they are like pressing, tackling in a variety of ways. And we know that like rate of force development can be delayed in ACL rehab. So making sure like we're not just testing like can that quad is that 10% within the other limb, but can we develop that force quickly as well, both for the quads and the hamstrings? So emphasizing that aspect of the training, not just can they get strong, how fast can they recruit that muscle seems to be also really important. And maybe when we're looking at like returning the player to the game, instead of like putting the player, I guess, only on for 10 minutes and then taking them off, it may be good to actually leave them on because we see that technically risk would reduce if you play longer because they tend to only occur early within the game. So there's other things that we can look at or to actually expose these players to these high demands or strategically putting them out of the periods where intensity isn't the highest if you're feeling at risk. So there's a lot that we can sort of speculate and think about. And it would be, I think that's what we were talking to some of our supervisors about is like, well, like return to play, this can quite inform other aspects. So we're sort of seeing how this can just branch out and opens up a lot more questions, unfortunately, to look at, but it's good. Keeps me thinking and on my toes.
And that kind of brings up the question for me. If let's say we have a player who's returning and we want to get them into a game for some game minutes, is it that it's the first, in your say the first 45 minutes, the first 28 minutes, or that 15 to 35 minute window that seems to be the highest intensity and highest risk? Is it that it's that game period that's most I guess dangerous, for lack of a better term, in terms of ACL injury risk? Or is it when they've been playing? So if a substitute comes on in the second half, is it them playing for the first 30 minutes or is it the game minutes that matters?
That's a good question. I guess it's both, unfortunately, because we know, like, yeah, periods at the early phases are going to be intense, but what we see is with substitutes, they also come in quite fast and hard. There's a reason why we strategically put them on in certain periods to change the tempo and pace of the game. So it's hard to know exactly what would be a better way to introduce them to the periods. Is it that first part where it's more likely to be intense, or is it better to put them on as a sub where they're more likely to be more intense, to be more of an impact? Unfortunately, I don't really have an answer for that. I don't know what would be, but I couldn't answer that. I'm not too sure because they're both just going to have intensities highest. I would see them coming on as a substitute would be probably a bit safe because the players around them are probably going to be not as fast or reactive or quick, especially if it's at the end of like the game or end of the half.
Yeah, that's what I was going to add next was probably, yes, that individual player has that increased intensity. That's why, like you're saying, that's why you bring them in. But the players around them aren't necessarily at that same level of intensity. And also tying back in that neurocognitive component is the game isn't necessarily as open at that point. And so there isn't maybe that like the neurosensory processing errors happening as much or as often or as intensely as earlier in the game. Plus, substitutes tend to come on with very specific instructions and, coaching cues from the coach, from the manager of you're going on to do this. Like there's a specific role for them to focus on and do. So maybe less of that neurocognitive component.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we talked a little bit about the return to play testing, and I like what you said about like the rate of force development being a key thing. You know, in clinics, it's great now. People are using things like handheld dynamometers to look at force production, and I do think that maybe the next level of that would be, okay, what's the rate of force development that they're able to produce? Same thing with like having force plates in clinics now, and utilizing force plates throughout rehab training and monitoring and testing is, okay, what is the reactive strength index, or what does that look like? What are some other kind of return to play testing or just kind of monitoring metrics that you use and or recommend for teams to use with athletes coming back from an ACL injury? Are there other metrics that you think might be important that tie into this research you've done?
Yeah, so when we look at like just like as a whole, what our data sports is like, yeah, that rate of force development. But what I would think is also just the players' wellness and like well-being, like in terms of like how they are they stressed, like are they ready to play? Are they like sleeping well? We know there are other factors that can contribute to risk other than specific objective measures that we can measure through force or like speed. So I think it's also not to neglect the person as well when doing these testing, like actually making sure, are they ready to play? Are they confident? Have they been doing all right? Are they more stressed than usual? Like there's like that famous like we look at the research with like college athletes, and one of the biggest risk factors for like injury was like study periods or like periods of exam. So that cognitive load. So I think that's also something that we should also think about when we're identifying risk, is the person themselves. Like, are they wanting to play? Like, are they physically ready? Yeah, that's, I guess, other than the metrics that we've looked at, is, yeah, specifically the person. I think that's all very important.
That's such a great point. Like the feedback from the player and how they're feeling in their body while trying to play and return to playing. Like I had a player I have in mind right now who, you know, all of the objective metrics, she crushed, she's great. Anything that we can assess objectively, she looks really good. But she kept saying after training sessions, like, I just don't feel as quick and she had a specific moment of the game in mind. She played central midfielder. She was more like a box to box midfielder, more endurance type. And she said, when I receive the ball and have to quickly turn to switch the point of attack, I feel like I'm not doing that quickly enough, and that's leaving me vulnerable to getting tackled or having to then make like a last second decision, movement wise, and reacting to the opposing player. So it was so interesting to hear, like, you know, yes, all the objective testing that we did, you look really good, but you have this specific moment that you need to be able to do that you're not feeling confident in.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because when we think about the players and we like talk to them and think about, are they ready, making sure they feel confident in certain parts of the game. And that's where like the training comes in, like small sided games, all those things where they're developing those skills and getting more confident. And I'm like, oh no, I can do it. It's okay. Like, so I think, yeah, great point.
So you published this first study looking at timing of ACL injuries, all of the implications that we've discussed so far. What are you looking at next, and how does this tie into kind of next steps in your PhD?
Yeah, so after this, the next phase is looking at the biomechanics and contextual factors of these injuries. So we're going to look further in terms of the moments beforehand, such as like a video analysis. That will provide us better idea of if there are any trends or consistent themes that we're seeing. But then we're wanting to look at, I guess, like that the chronic workload, and as well as travel, and seeing if there's any trends with that, because there's that research for like the FIFA Pro that's found some good insights that may be increasing risk. So looking at that type of fatigue. And yeah, what we're hoping to do is in the future is maybe look at neuromuscular test within a lab study and see if there's any changes in that acute setting of fatigue, which may provide the implications of how fatigue might influence ACL injuries.
I'm so curious about those contextual factors you're talking about. And you mentioned travel, which is funny. That's exactly what I was going to ask about, is things like travel, here in the US, going across multiple time zones. I know it's the same in Australia. I actually went to Australia for the Women's World Cup 2 years ago, and I was in Brisbane. It was my first time in Australia. And I remember thinking to myself when I was there, I was like, well, I haven't been to Australia before. Maybe I'll pop down to Sydney and see what that's like. And I was like, oh, that is really far. I had no idea how far that was going to be. But so going across multiple time zones, having games after having traveled that far. I know there is one of the performance directors in the MLS who I know, he had been looking at him and a couple other people, Garrison Draper, and I think Stacey Harden was looking at this too. We're looking at kind of scaling or providing a scale for how difficult or intense a match was based on some of those contextual factors, like how far they had to travel, how many time zones they had to cross, how many nights they're on the road. So is this the third game in a 3-week road trip because you're all the way up in Seattle playing 3 teams on the East Coast here in the US? And so what are some of the other contextual factors that you're hoping to look at in the next phase?
Yeah, some other factors what we'll be looking at is, I guess, the type of match. And I guess within those periods, like the timing, what is the score of the match and things like that, which might provide insights to the intensity where players, it makes sense. What we're most likely going to find out is it's going to be a drawing scenario, right? Early phases, but also the type of turf, if they're playing away, national games, all those factors in terms of travel distance, and if they're switched teams, different clubs, all those different things that we're wanting to look at.
And I know that this first paper that you did actually look at positional differences. Would you mind just quickly touching on what those were and why maybe that might be?
Yeah, so we found that there was slight differences in the different positions, right? But there was nothing meaningful in terms of significant. The only thing that was significant was the difference between the goalkeepers. So what we found, we're hoping to do in the future research, in the next study, is see if there's any positional differences in terms of the situational patterns or exactly where they're occurring, which may provide actual insights into how we can better prepare those players and what is the most highest risk scenarios for specific positions. I think that's don't get me wrong, we saw small differences between the the midfielders, the attackers, and defenders, right? But I think going further deeper and looking at the scenarios and the contextual factors around each position may provide insights into tailoring injury prevention programs or just rehabilitation as well. I guess return to sport.
Yeah, I'm wondering too, because even within a position group, 2 players can have vastly different playing styles, physical qualities, and that might be team related and team playing style related and come from the manager and what the style of play they want to play. It might be based on who the opponent is and how they're trying to play against a specific opponent. It might just be their innate gifts and strengths, and this is how they play. And so I'm wondering about interposition differences, and if maybe there is some way to bucket players into okay, you are this type of player, you're a quick, explosive winger, or you are, because there could even be in one playing style, let's say a 3-5-2, an outside midfielder / winger might have the exact same game situations and risk factors and load within a game as an outside back in like a 4-3-3, just depending on how the coaching style is or what the game is demanding at the time. So it's so hard to even say like the positional, like break it down into positions, because there can be so much variety within that even.
Yeah, and that was one of our limitations that we just keep saying. Like, we'll love, like, unfortunately, using online data, we can only get so much about the players, so we can only really get them into like those 3 or 4 positions. But yeah, understanding like contextual factors, tailoring it towards that individual. Like, how do they play? What do they prefer? Are they explosive? Are they going to do high pressing? Like, all those other factors that influences the player, which may make him, like, at that high level, one of the best players in the world to a point, makes them so unique. So understanding like the specific like factors to the individual seems to be an interesting part of this as well.
Yeah, well, Wyatt, I could go on for hours talking about this, but I do have 2 last rapid fire questions that I ask everyone. They're more fill in the blank as opposed to, standard questions. And so the first one is, I wish everyone in women's soccer knew this about ACL injury risk.
Yes. Oh, good point. I think the most important thing would be that it's mostly through this pressing or tackling position, really understanding the situation of it. If we can understand that it's more that defending, we can better prepare players for that skill and different variety. So yeah, it would be understanding that most of these are occurring through a pressing or tackling. I think we understand that and give good opportunities for coaches to potentially train in a variety of ways.
Okay, very good. And then the last one is, my favorite thing about working in and around women's soccer is.
I guess it's the personalities, all the variety and the different talks and the chats, and it keeps you on your toes. And it's just like a fun and just good population just to work with. It's just like funny, the banter, especially in Australia. You hear some unique stuff, and it's good to be around like that culture. It's a very, very positive and just like uplifting culture. That's probably the best part.
Definitely. It's good vibes in women's soccer. Everyone come see what it's about.
100%, 100%, especially in Australia. It's only good things here.
Well, Wyatt, thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate your time, and I'm so looking forward to reading the rest of your PhD work and beyond that as well. So thank you so much.
No, thank you, Nicole. Really appreciate it.